Sorry.
Well, welcome to our great panel. I'm looking forward to a great discussion about how we can really harness the power of AI to help us develop treatments for people with neurological illness and how to monitor their performance. So on the panel with me, we have Dr. Crum, Dr. Galatzer-Levy, Dr. Manji, and Dr. Sandrock. They'll give brief introductions about themselves. I just want to say that we are at an unprecedented time in the neurosciences where we have much better understanding of the biology behind some of the illnesses, development of what we think are going to be really effective treatments. But at the same time, we have some challenges with really an aging population and a huge number of people affected by neurological illnesses, and really a shortage of neurologists and other type of physicians and care providers to see them. So it's an incredible opportunity to see how we can harness some of the things that we've heard over the last 2 days, and we'll hear from the panel to help both in diagnosis as well as care and delivery of treatments and ways to follow our patients. So I'm really excited to be here, and I think we'll just have each of the panelists tell us a little bit about themselves, and then we'll dive into the discussion.
Thank you, Merit. Thanks for having me. So, I'm Poppy Crum. I'm chief scientist at Dolby Laboratories. I'm also an adjunct professor at Stanford. My background, I'm a neurophysiologist, many years primate physiologist, and sensory. I've been studying the senses for most of my life. The reason I think what I've been working on lately over the past 9 years at Dolby, people may not realize Dolby is, we touch senses, we touch experiences. And consequently, we spend a lot of time understanding computationally how the human experience can be understood and how technology is interacting and closing that loop for what we can anticipate in the future. There's a huge opportunity and change happening in this between the different areas, whether it's where consumer technology, and I mean the entertainment space, the lifestyle space, and the healthcare space are converging with regard to the types of technologies that can benefit and improve opportunities in both directions.
Thank you. Isaac?
Hi, my name's Isaac. I run the R&D department at a company called AiCure, and I'm on the faculty at NYU in the Department of Psychiatry and Bioinformatics. At AiCure, we use computer vision and a cell phone-based platform to detect and monitor medication adherence and to build models, new models of clinical phenotypes to be used as new endpoints in clinical trials, and also to flag risk in population health settings. So can we detect changes in mood, cognition, movement, changes in clinical functioning to stave off risk in severe mental illness, really across the board in the context of physical illness. So for example, after a heart attack, about 10 to 20% of people will develop depression, and they have double the probability of a second heart attack within 2 years and double the probability of mortality within 2 years. So can we spot that kind of risk early on and intervene early is really the goal of our work.
Thank you. I'm Husseini Manji, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm the Global Therapeutic Area Head for Janssen, which is the pharmaceutical arm of Johnson & Johnson. Prior to that, I was at the NIH for 15 years. In my role, we're focusing on the major neurologic, neurodegenerative in particular, and neuropsychiatric diseases, largely because I think you all know the unmet need. You've heard about the impending tsunami of Alzheimer's disease. Today, 50 million people are afflicted with it, and with our growing aging population, the numbers are going to treble in the coming years. And almost at the other end of the age spectrum, we have the serious mental illnesses, which have been identified as the most disabling conditions in the world, largely because they're common, they're lifelong, and they hit people very young, so that they are the chronic diseases of the young. We've recognized that nothing is more complex than neuroscience, and AI and machine learning can play a big role in that. And similar to what you heard from Poppy and Isaac, we also think that the digital technology revolution is poised to make a real difference. So certainly we want to directly tackle the biology of these illnesses, but if we can use a lot of the digital technologies, we can really start to move the needle, intervene early, and in some of these psychiatric conditions, predict and preempt to reduce the devastation.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Al Sandrock. I'm Chief Medical Officer at Biogen, and I'm a neurologist by training. At Biogen, we're doing several things sort of in the MS space where there are already a number of drugs that are approved, but how you follow the patients, how do you know that they're on the right drugs? We have started a 10-center initiative where we are doing consistent iPad-based measurements of performance, of vision, cognition, walking speed, et cetera, patient-reported outcomes, and also doing quantitative imaging where we can actually measure lesion load and brain atrophy. So I'm very interested in how we measure disease, which in neurology, I think we were very good at localizing the lesions, but not necessarily good at following progression. And then I want to also support what Husseini said, which is that in these neurodegenerative diseases, I believe we're going to have to treat really early, perhaps when people are still normal, because what we've learned is that these diseases start 20 years before first symptoms in the case of Alzheimer's disease. So if we want to really have a good disease-modifying approach, we're going to have to treat early. So later on, maybe I'll touch on concepts related to AI, which could help us perhaps detect disease early.
So maybe I'll ask the first question to Husseini and Al, if you start to touch about what are the areas that you think AI might be already relevant and also maybe in the future in the space of neurological disorders.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a great question, and I think this conference speaks to the fact that AI is really revolutionizing healthcare. So in my opinion, AI is going to treat and help healthcare in neuropsychiatric and neurodegenerative disorders in some ways the same way it's helping other fields of medicine, and in some ways perhaps distinct. And if I could take a moment, I'll explain what I mean. To me, big data can be classified as data that is characterized by volume, velocity, variety, and complexity. And in many fields of medicine, for example, volume AI takes the place of reading images or biopsies. Velocity AI makes sense of rapid cardiac signals and cardiac monitoring. Variety you can think of in an ICU setting, making a lot of sense of disparate signals in real time. So I think AI is going to help neuroscience in all those kinds of things, which are by and large things that humans do today, but AI can do it better and more efficiently. But where I think AI can really shine for neuroscience is in the last dimension, which is the complexity, because nothing is more complex than these conditions where you've got to make sense of the inheritance of multiple susceptibility and protective genes, how they result in changes in protein networks, cellular phenotypes, neuronal circuits, and then the most challenging clinical phenotypes you can think of: memory, attention, different facets of cognition, mood, etc. And AI can really help us there. I think Al and I will probably talk a little bit about more in terms of also the potential of using this for early diagnosis and intervention and tracking progression of disease. But I think the opportunity is very rich. Some challenges that we'll also talk about, but the opportunity is rich.
Yeah, I completely agree with Husseini. I think, in the case of neuro, I think we have some inherent advantages. We have complexity as sort of a disadvantage, but on the other hand, a lot of the devices and sensors we have around us already actually are just interfaces with our nervous system. And so I think that there's a lot of promise, and we already see evidence of this. We have these performance tests and things that we do perhaps in the doctor's office now where we get patients to do certain things. But I like the concept of passive measurements between doctor's visits, which can, using AI, you probably already will know before the patient comes into the office roughly what they have. But I guess but I want to reiterate this promise of early intervention. And when we've studied people with dominantly inherited diseases, whether it's ALS or Alzheimer's disease, we detect changes long before first symptoms. We can now start to detect them even in the serum. For example, serum neurofilament goes up 10 years prior to first symptoms in Alzheimer's disease. PET imaging shows amyloid accumulation. There have to be changes in the brain that passive assessment can monitor and tell you when you need to go and get PET scanned or get your serum neurofilament checked. So I think there's some inherent advantages that I hope people like Poppy and Isaac help us figure out how to do.
Well, then we'll go to Poppy. That's a big task. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the work that you do on sensors, both speech and audio, and how that can help us predict health and disease.
Absolutely. I think there are two things that I would say. One is to both Husseini and Al's discussion is the implications for early diagnosis from the data we give off as humans that we often overlook, whether it's our breath, whether it's our pupil, we know that our eyes dilate to light in the environment. They also dilate to our engagement and our cognitive load. When it's an ambiguous signature, but once you pair that with information coming from other sensory senses, other capture from other sensors, you can disambiguate that. You can know the context of the environment and understand what someone's trying to achieve in that environment. In our breath, at my company, we can see just in the chemical composition of someone's breath what emotion they're experiencing, whether it's fear, suspense, or joy, and changes in CO2, isoprene, and acetone. That kind of interaction with the context of what they're trying to achieve becomes very relevant. I think you've had people already talking about the power of a very inexpensive and hugely impactful sensor, a microphone. What we can do with a microphone is, I think that's the most valuable sensor we can adopt from consumer technology right now. We know in the dynamics of our speech that it can predict many different health conditions much earlier than as humans we're necessarily effective at, namely because you've got ubiquitous sensing, you have this unprecedented longitudinal opportunity to track an individual and know how they are changing relative to their history. You have the ability to also identify parameters that are better amplified for that individual that determine their change. In the space of a microphone, looking at something like our temporal patterns and our pauses and how someone's the dynamics of their speech can shows up in clinical assessments of Alzheimer's often earlier than the diagnosis. They're seeing linguistic changes. These are very effective and for detecting, and I'm not a clinician, so I want to be very careful. But there's quite a bit of data on this, and perhaps you've already spoken about some of it. But this is great for mild to moderate symptoms, and it's not just tracking the dynamics of the speech, but you're pairing that with an understanding of the context and the environment that someone might be having those temporal patterns, those different dynamical changes. And machine learning and AI is critical for all of this. But when you pair that with the context of what they're trying to do in that environment, you suddenly gain, that ambiguity that we might have fear and apprehension about letting algorithms drive us becomes hugely impactful and insightful. The thing, though, that I think is, and similarly, heart disease, diabetes, all have signatures in the spectral coloration because you can have effects that alter how someone speaks in modulation. You can see things in high frequency ranges. They get change for an individual. But how we think about these becomes very interesting. And everyone here, the beginning I started with is this convergence of fields, because when I look at what who is bringing these to market, who has the biggest potential impact to elevate, introduce wellness, and mental and physical wellness, integrate those together better. But there are a lot of consumer technology companies that aren't the typical people you think about, where every sense, whether it's EEG, whether it's my galvanic skin response, whether it's my even my electrooculogram, your eye creates a dipole when it moves, and you can pick up where your eyes are pointed in your ear, but you can pick up stress levels. All of this you can pick up in your ear. It no longer has to be on your body. It moves to your spaces, and it moves to a very personal diagnostic system to your internal wellness of both physical and mental state. And now you've got companies that build, are using that same information to potentially drive an entertainment experience are actually capturing a lot of critical data to human wellness. And because they're tracking emotion, they care about how effective that technology is. You've also got companies like cable companies who historically are very good at putting infrastructure in homes. They have an aging demographic. They move from cable to home security systems, and many are moving towards ubiquitous sensing and how that can be leveraged for autonomous aging. And you've got a lot of players and spaces that are leveraging their capacity, their capability through machine learning and AI to bring the offerings and the opportunities to new market spaces that are very much centered on health and wellness.
Well, thank you, Poppy. Isaac, you have a similar interest, but perhaps a different approach that could be well added to this. Can you share a little bit about your work?
Yeah, so I would say me and Poppy are very aligned, that there's important signals that all of a sudden we have an enormous amount of access to, and we can start thinking about how are those clinically relevant. I think the real opportunity we have here is to redefine the clinical phenotype based on direct observation rather than a sort of proxy observation through a clinician or through someone's self-report. So if we think about the problems in neurology, psychiatry, mental health, we put an enormous amount of effort into how do we model and define our biological measurements. So if we think about imaging, this is something that's moved very rapidly in the last 5-10 years, genetics, genomics, proteomics. If I used methods from 10 years ago, I would be laughed out of the lab. I wouldn't be able to get funding. Yet our Y side of the equation, how we define our clinical phenotype, has not changed in 30 years. It actually predates our modern concepts in neuroscience. And we can just never win that battle if we have a noisy outcome. We just can never find the signal that we're looking for. That's a fundamental problem from my perspective. Now we have an opportunity to measure the primary outputs of the central nervous system directly, which are motor behavior, physiology, and we can quantify those on single dimensions and understand how are those affected by the biology that we're interested in, how does a compound affect them, how does a population move over time? And importantly, by being able to capture that level of data, we can start to define clinical distributions based on those characteristics. So if we think about EEG, we think about skin conductance, we think about facial features of motion, which I'm particularly interested in, or voice characteristics. We don't presently have a definition of what it means to be sick or healthy based on those dimensions, or what change looks like in a healthy or pathological way. And we have an opportunity to define those distributions and really move away from the current ways of defining clinical phenotypes that really across the board we're unhappy with, whether it's in pharma or insurance companies or in research. We're not happy with our current definitions, but we don't have a good way to move forward. And what I see technology companies having an enormous opportunity to do is to define those and provide those to the scientific community so that we can start to understand better what are the signals. So if we think about, say, a feature like movement, which is truly transdiagnostic, on one end of the spectrum you see in depression and schizophrenia, psychomotor retardation, you see agitation in anxiety disorders. If you look at bipolar disorder, we see variability in that, all the way up to Parkinsonian tremors or essential tremor. And we actually know the neurobiological substrates that drive those movement characteristics. But then when we, when we do our trials or when we do our research, we use clinical definitions that we know are heterogeneous, we know are heuristic. So what is Alzheimer's disease? What is depression? It isn't a monolith. We know that now. We know that it's a heuristic that we use. And if we can't redefine those definitions, we really are not going to be able to move the needle forward, in my opinion. And in my opinion, that's really going to be a team sport, because in healthcare, we're not going direct to consumer. So we're not able to rapidly develop those kind of definitions. We need to partner with the key gatekeepers and stakeholders from pharma, from insurance, major medical centers, institutes at NIH to really work together to say, how are we going to move together in that direction?
Thank you. So, one of the challenges in neurological illnesses is the heterogeneity. You guys mentioned this a little bit. I was wondering maybe Husseini or Al, from the company's perspective with drug therapies, are you already using AI to try to deal with that in the trials?
Absolutely. So I think that's
some examples.
That's very correct. And as Isaac correctly pointed out, these are not monolithic illnesses. And one of the things I think we already know, from the genomics and other sort of things, risk factors, et cetera, we can identify baseline static risk. What we really need is dynamics. So we need to understand subpopulations, and we need to understand change. So absolutely, we're currently doing it. And maybe I can just give a couple of examples. So as Al eloquently mentioned, in Alzheimer's, it's incontrovertible. The disease starts decades before you have the overt diagnosis. To have a successful disease-modifying drug, you've got to intervene early, and I'd just like to take a sidebar to congratulate Al and Biogen for their steadfast effort in this field, even though it's so complex. So I think we know that there are some early changes that Al mentioned you can pick up passively. There are some things that you could do slightly more actively. So we know things like verbal memory, spatial orientation, processing speed are all things you could pick up. And not only could it replace paper and pencil in terms of convenience, there's good reason to believe it's actually going to be better and objective, and the retest validity. You could do it at home, so you spare people numerous clinic visits. Often we're talking about elderly people. You could, sort of democratize research. So you do it in a geographically distributed way, not just at MGH or, other major centers, et cetera. And I think these things could actually become surrogate endpoints. The FDA is accepting that a surrogate endpoint is not just a fluid measure. If you can really objectively quantitate this, I think that could become, very useful. We could monitor trajectory, so identify people early, monitor trajectory. Coming back directly to the question Merit asked, so I think as you can imagine, if in the pharmaceutical industry, when you're planning to get a drug approved, you have to work with what the FDA currently has as their guidelines. I think the FDA is actually very reasonable, and when you sit down with them and explain that some things may not, really be fit for purpose, they'll work with you. But often it's an iterative process. So in certain trials, similar to what Isaac said, we'll build in the bread and butter classic measures, even though we know they're far from perfect, while concurrently building in measures, for example, of motoric change, measures of what's called hedonic drive, motivation, et cetera, and try and show that these things really are valid, so that for the next indication, we'll try and use these as specific endpoints. I know I'm talking a lot, but I'll give you one more example, and then I'll turn it over to Al. And then coming back to Merit's question, autism spectrum disorders is a good example. It's not one condition. And what we basically took the view that, unless we can really understand subgroups, not only based on, sort of clinical definitions, but also which symptoms, which ones are more variable, which ones can you accurately measure, because you're going to have to show a change with your intervention. So we created something called JAKE, or Janssen Autism Knowledge Engine, which brings in information from diverse sources, the child themselves, their parent, their school teacher, their pediatrician, as well as biomarker, eye gaze, and other things. So now we can get a homogeneous subgroup in whom we've got baseline measures to see how stable they are, and now we're intervening with a treatment that we hope will make a difference. And the hope is that having come up with a homogeneous population and really come up with standardized ways to measure something, if the drug works, you'll be able to see it. In the past, it may be that we shelved effective drugs because we kind of took all comers and hoped for the best. And it's really not going to be a one-size-fits-all. So I do think that's one of the things that could be most exciting about AI, machine learning, et cetera.
Well, I completely agree with Husseini. I've been thinking, could we kind of merge what we do in clinical trials now with sort of clinical practice in some ways? So in clinical trials, we often have an examining neurologist and a treating neurologist. And the treating neurologist takes care of the patient, gets all the symptoms, but the examining neurologist is basically doing the measurements. So I was wondering whether in the future what we could do is to sort of separate the obtaining of measurements from the care of patients and maybe have a you measured the word standardized, consistent. That's what we do in clinical trials, standardization and consistency. But what if we had sort of measurement centers where people went to get scanned, to get assessed in various ways? That could be integrated with the passive measurements that are from your iPhone and from the home. And everybody has to undergo standardized measurements. And in neuro, you can imagine what they are, right? And then you could have AI say then, this is what we do when we examine patients, by the way. We do a broad exam, and then we see something, and we want to hone in on a certain system. And so you could use AI to then, in the same center, adapt the measurements so that you hone in on the problem areas, if you will. But that could all be done separately in a very consistent way. Frankly, I think it should be done even in normal people so that we can detect disease early. And then we have all that information feeding to the treating doctor, who may get a decision support device, essentially, that integrates that information and makes suggestions in terms of disease categorization and maybe even treatments. And then imagine if you could start engage those same things, not only for the care of patients, but for clinical trials. Because it takes so long just to get clinical trials started and everything. You could even have FDA be part of those measurement centers so that they see how, right now you do clinical trial, the FDA comes and audits after the trial. They go to the sites, and here you could just have the FDA there making sure that the objective measurements are gathered. I think this could really, improve care, but also really speed up the way we do trials, and maybe even do what we've been saying here all along, which is to detect disease really, really early. And the FDA has opened up pathways for example, for Alzheimer's. Just last year, they introduced the concept of stage 1, stage 2 disease. These are pre-symptomatic stages of disease, biomarker-based. And you can imagine that it would be assessment, it could be passive assessment-based. And so maybe that's the future. Yeah.
Could I just echo one comment? Agree 100% with everything Al said, but I just echo one comment because, in this room we may probably have, differing opinions, but I think, in my opinion, the way we're thinking about using some of this information is to assist and improve medical practice. So it wouldn't necessarily take the place of the medical professional healthcare visit, but right now I think many of you in the audience may know, people are overwhelmed, overworked. They've got a few minutes with the patient trying to almost go through a checklist. Tell me how you slept, tell me about this, tell me about this. And we know from all kinds of data that when the patient is reporting things, they're basically talking about the last day or two, not the last 3 months. So if you could almost have the information available during the clinic visit, where not only is it synthesized, it's objective, it's coherent, et cetera, you can pick up signals, et cetera, but then it actually improves the quality of the physician-patient time. It's not someone just doing a checklist. It's actually bringing back empathy and care. So I think sometimes when we think of machine learning, artificial intelligence, et cetera, we think we're going in this direction of, taking out the human factor out of it. I think if we do it correctly, it's actually going to enhance the human factor. And I think that's something we need to be cognizant of.
Our opportunities seem enormous and so exciting. I was wondering maybe if Poppy and Isaac could talk a little bit about what you see as the challenges, particularly around getting access to the data or getting the right people in the field to
No, everything you're talking about sounds wonderful, and I think I can't. The role of looking towards companies and places where this data will be coming from that are non-traditional, I can't overemphasize, sorry. Yeah. But you think about something, if we're talking about Alzheimer's, again, obviously you've got, your smart speakers sitting in your homes, but all of that information, two things, the ear, hugely powerful point of personalized, the interface between my underlying physical and mental wellness between my external environment. But the ear becomes this incredible place to both read and write my physical and mental success, because you have the ability to track all of the same biometrics that we might capture, including EEG, but you also have the ability to stimulate the vagal nerve if you have an intent to bootstrap plasticity or think about depression and PTSD. This becomes a critical part, I believe, in a near future, where you're both capturing a lot of personal information, but you're intersecting with the user in a very personalized relationship that can have huge impact on mental and physical wellness. Now, I put my glasses on, and suddenly 15 years ago, the pupillometry we did in labs was a $30,000 device sitting, that we use to track things. Today, it's dollars and will be cents very soon in every pair of smart glasses, and frankly, every pair of glasses that we probably wear in 5 to 10 years. You will know where someone's gaze is directed. You will know, based on diameter of pupil, you'll know their cognitive effort associated with that moment in time for that entire longitudinal time series. So suddenly, that cognitive effort paired with a microphone that's giving me context to make sense of that stimulus. For early indicators of Alzheimer's, I've got temporal dynamics tracking, in machine learning models tracking the voice, but it becomes really insightful when I also know what elements in that environment are triggering, memory retrievals are triggering maybe increased cognitive load where they otherwise hadn't in the past. That, it's a very personalized assessment. So what, the onus is on, the difficulty is how you use that data. The data is incredibly rich, incredibly important, I think, in how we enable early intervention and a better personalized response to some of these conditions. But it's to all of you how we actually use that data in a way that's effective and people feel trusting of what they do with it.
Yeah. So I would say to the question of data, healthcare technology is not necessarily the same, the same structures as technology development generally, where I can go straight to consumer, start to generate data, improve my models, and that's really how AI works. I have a machine learning model, I have some inputs, I'm able to do rapid feedback and improve my models, and so that works really well if I'm developing, say, an online shoe store to rapidly sell you shoes. But healthcare is a much more closed system, where for good reason, data is much more protected, and there's a need to really develop collaboration to get data. So on the machine learning side, on the computational side, I would just 100% agree with Poppy that we're really just in an era where we can do very impressive things, and the models are very impressive, and there's things that are developing that are clearly going to come to fruition. But the other data sources we need are well-characterized clinical populations where we have well-characterized biology or manipulation on compounds, so that we can start to link those characteristics. And so for that to happen, you really need collaboration at a very high level across stakeholders to produce that kind of data. So the signals that Poppy's talking about or I'm talking about are only going to have clinical value as much as we can relate them to clinical populations, as we can relate them to the biological characteristics that we know drive CNS disorders, as they're useful to discover new treatments or understand neurobiology better. And so we're really going to have, in my opinion, to generate those kind of data sets, I think everybody in all their corners are doing a very good job. And if we can come together and start to create data sets that have all of these characteristics, then I think we can do very well. We've done generally badly at saying, let's take all this data we already have and post hoc, let's throw it together. Because it's put together, each investigator acts differently, it's very heterogeneous, and and it wasn't designed for these kind of big data analyses. So at the end of the day, we've seen some big examples of that where you just are not able to harmonize that kind of data. So there has to be real plan up front about how we're going to approach it, what are the data sources, what is our big data analytic plan, and I think it's just going to require a very large level of collaboration and everybody really putting skin in the game to make it work.
Are there concerns or things that you are thinking about to make sure that we're getting the data from wide enough or diverse enough population?
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to.
So sure. So I think I would echo everything you just heard. Data, and trying to amalgamate it, do it in a systematic way, et cetera. So we've got a long way to go. I think things are moving in the right direction, especially in dementia. And I think perhaps that's one place where Europe is ahead of the US. Many of you may know that about 5.5 years ago, former UK Prime Minister David Cameron hosted a G8 summit on dementia that actually pulled a lot of stakeholders together. It's actually been very powerful. So the NIH budget for dementia has tripled, Canada, Japan, et cetera, et cetera. There was the launch of a dementia discovery fund that Bill Gates has joined. Bill Gates, you may have read, has recently pulled Jeff Bezos in, so that's to do new research. And just about in December, we had a follow-on meeting, and one of the things is about harmonizing data, and there's something called the IMI, which is the Innovative Medicines Initiative in the EU, where there's a lot of efforts to try and pull together data from disparate sources, and there's something that's a UK-specific program called the Deep and Frequent Phenotyping Project in dementia, where you start out with elderly people and monitor them longitudinally with imaging, with fluid, with cognition, with motoric, you name it, collected, et cetera, to make sense of it. One of the things when as Isaac said, at a high level, so we're actually trying to see if we can even get legislative changes to share data across borders, because that's started to become one of those issues, and any individual group can't do it. So we've got a long way to go. I think there's more progress. In my opinion, if it's okay with Merit, while we're talking about this thing, and I think there are challenges, and I think if we're not cognizant of the challenges and pretend this is all hunky-dory, et cetera, we're going to run into problems. And I think the challenges fall in two buckets, societal and technological. Societal, I think is, one of them is obvious. Everyone thinks privacy and ethics. But I think when you think about it, conditions of the brain and the mind are more sensitive than, do you have AFib? And I think we need to go overboard, because if you're going to identify someone is destined for Alzheimer's disease in 15 years, or you're monitoring declining cognitive trajectory, and maybe making prognosis, that has to be amazingly guarded. Because today, in a one-to-one setting, we do, disclose prognosis, et cetera, but that's in a one-to-one confined setting. It's not information in the cloud that could be acquired and used by insurance companies to deny coverage, or employers to do nefarious things, et cetera. So I think just like the finance industry's built in safeguards, we need to think about that. The second thing on a societal standpoint, on the face of it, I think most of us would think that these digital technologies will, for example, democratize healthcare more because everyone has a smartphone, et cetera. But I think the algorithms we're going to develop, the sophisticated algorithms, are going to be derived from multiple different data sources that include home sensors, car sensors, voice-based, et cetera. And it may be that along socioeconomic spectrum, it's not equal. So we have to be careful that the algorithms we generate aren't just from people with means because they have these technologies, et cetera. Now, it's certainly something, the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages, but we need to be thoughtful. A couple more things that I consider technological challenges. So one of the obvious benefits of AI and machine learning is that it's an iterative, evolving process. So that's the good news. The bad news is and I think for a lot of these things that are going to determine healthcare outcomes, these things might well have FDA regulation. So if you've got an algorithm that got regulated and approved by the FDA, and then there's more data generated in real time that wants to refine it, what's the process? Do you go back to the FDA and say, oh, now we've learned this new thing happened, so we need to update it? Because the rate of change is tremendous. Similarly, the rate of change in devices, most of us have probably replaced our smartphones in the last year, et cetera, and most of this is being developed by big technology companies. We need to make sure there's interoperability, because for something like neurodegenerative disorders, where you're talking about slowly evolving illnesses over years, the data can't not be able to sync with the new information, et cetera. And if we just leave it to the individual device companies, the interoperability isn't something that they're tackling. And then the last thing, again, similar to what Al was saying, we need to think about these things in the healthcare context. So I think the sensors and the smartphones and the digital technology are going to be fantastic, but somehow it's got to be married to hospital information. The context about the data you're gathering matters. And right now, they're these separate things, and somehow we got to pull them together. But if we can pull them together, I think the potential is staggering. Okay?
Thank you. I think, Papa, you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, I do believe the democratization opportunity is there. That, right now you already have that differentiation, and it's only, we have the opportunity to pull that together. But to all the brilliant ideas that everyone is discussing from the perspective of someone more in the consumer space, I would say that please think about not reaching the demographic that's already concerned with dementia or concerned because of their history. Instead, you've got to focus for early diagnosis on the capacity, the capability is there for technologies that can reach billions of people at a much earlier age than they would typically engage with tracking and monitoring. And there is not enough pulling together of the healthcare and the lifestyle consumer spaces, because going to a kiosk or a center to test myself and get a lot of information that can help improve, that's wonderful, but that's already a very select group. When in fact what you want to be thinking about is the thing that's going to be in everybody's home, and a 25-year-old is going to have it on their eyes or in their car, or well, it's not going to be whatever, the car that drives them around. But it's going to be something that becomes much more prevalent and ubiquitous in our lives and is not stigmatized or not something that I have to seek out in some way, but something that seeks me to help.
I think you're getting at actually some of the things that the audience is really asking about. So I want to just pose two of their questions, which are related. Is what are those key drivers that would make patients want to use these sensors, and also physicians? And related to that is also hospitals. What hospitals would want to use this type of technology to help with their neurological patients? I don't know if Isaac, you want to start?
I think that things that work, people want to adopt. Everyone here probably uses Uber and Lyft, not flagging a taxi, because it works all the time. It's very consistent, it's very trustworthy. So when doctors are better able to track how a patient's doing, when patients are getting better care, you're going to see a payoff. So a good example of that is the company I work at, AiCure. We track medication adherence, and we collect information on how patients are doing based on transdiagnostic features on their face and voice. And if we think about a context like, somebody's been given a new psychiatric medication, or really any medication, and it has a side effect profile that the patient can't tolerate, the doctor would be very happy to adjust that medication, but they don't have insight into how the patient's doing. So if I was to, poll this room, I bet, the psychiatrists and probably all the MDs in this room have had the experience of a patient coming, to a follow-up visit a month, 2 months later, and saying, how's that medication going? And say, oh, well, I stopped it 3 weeks ago because of X, Y, and Z side effect. And the physician said, well, I would have been happy to adjust that, or I'd try something different, but they just don't have insight into how the patient is doing. So these are the things that are not, so sexy about AI, but really where AI has really done a fantastic job is in logistics and transferring information. And one of the major problems in healthcare is the transfer of information, the communication between patients and their physicians, between physicians and the hospital system. We've had a lot of clunky examples of that we've all had to tolerate, like Epic, and as the world's moved in that direction. But at the end of the day, why do we all have 50 apps on our phone? Because they help our life, and they make it more convenient, and they give us a better outcome. So I think that's where you're going to start to see the payoff.
Yeah. Anyone else want to answer?
No, I mean, sorry. I was just going to say, I think I mentioned earlier shifts where you have companies like cable companies moving towards autonomous aging and enabling from leveraging all of the sensors they already have in homes for home security, in addition to other sensors that they are introducing. But their goal is, the amalgamated sensing is giving information to the caretaker, both about their physical state, but moreover about their mental state, about whether they're depressed, whether they, what they can capture about emotion. And if that enables someone, 10 years more living alone, that's a huge indicator of something people will sign up for.
If I could amplify both the previous speakers' comments, so I do think that if you can show sort of benefit and value and do it in a least cumbersome way, it's likely to get adopted. You know, I think as a society we've done a reasonably good job about emphasizing the importance of physical health. And if you think about some trends like, you know, smoking cessation, et cetera, we've actually done quite a bit. For some reason, cognitive and mental health, you know, what could be more important than your brain function, especially in our knowledge-based economy, we've sort of kept it separate. But I think if we can start to educate people about how important it is, I think what Isaac mentioned earlier, that the evidence that if you have depression, the comorbidities you have, so you're more likely to have cardiovascular disease, die after a heart attack, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, et cetera, to really emphasize how important this is. I think one of the other things is that sometimes people are a little bit nihilistic in this, you know, situation of Alzheimer's disease. You know, if you ask doctors, would your patient want to know that they're on their way if today you have no disease-modifying treatment, and you know, we don't. And they tend to think, no, patients probably wouldn't want to know. But when you actually speak to the patients, most people, not everyone, would actually like to know, you know, is this something I'm going to have? Because as you heard from Deepak Chopra and Rudy Tanzi, you know, these non-pharmacological interventions aren't going to cure Alzheimer's or stop it in its tracks. But there are things that you could do to even help you during the time. I think the last thing, coming back to Merit's question, is let's think of the other side of the equation. Hospitals, medical professionals, et cetera, they're overworked, they're trying to juggle many things, et cetera. So if you come with them with this huge thing, do this, trust me, it'll make life better, it ain't gonna happen. You've really gotta make it very user-friendly, and as Al was saying earlier, demonstrate that it actually improves outcomes and improves their engagement with patients. It's not yet another thing that someone is dictating, thou shalt do, because somehow we've got to move the needle.
Yeah, I've been thinking about how to incentivize patients too, because, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, we were just doing a trial with mild cognitive impairment. Why would anybody sign up and say, I have mild cognitive impairment? You may lose your job. You may have to have somebody drive you everywhere. So I would have a couple of answers. One is thou shalt do path. So we have things called the Recommended Uniform Screening Panel for newborn screening. So there's several dozen diseases that every baby gets tested for. Why do we do that? A, because there's treatments. So it's kind of a catch-22. If you don't have a treatment, you can't get it done. So it might be harder to get a treatment. But A, if there's a treatment, and B, if you prove that if you treat starting very early, it helps patients. So that's one way. The other way is, I would say, for home sensing devices, you know, we're all required to have fire alarms. So maybe, you know, and what could be more alarm, you know, to me, having Alzheimer's disease is equivalent to a fire. I mean, it's fatal. So there's that. But I would prefer the non-forcing methods, which would be, listen, I think I'm always impressed that when we have patients in our trials, a lot of them, even though sign up, even though they know it may not help them. They have very altruistic reasons for signing up for clinical trials. So if you were to say that by donating data, essentially, you help other people, and also, by the way, if we detect disease early in you, we may be able to help you too. And to me, it's the same kind of contract you make with people who are signing up for clinical trials in some ways, you know? So I think both approaches probably ultimately will be used.
Great.
Some of the questions from the audience are back to the challenge we talked about of making sure that the data is from diverse groups. So one of the questions is, how do we ensure that the data is from enough of a group that you're not only training on people with classic textbook diseases and you get all the outliers and the diversity?
Yeah. So I would say, you know, these are classic problems in sampling, you know, and so we need to think about, first of all, you know, how do we sample real clinic populations, real diverse populations, instead of focusing on people with really a narrow disease state. And I think generally clinical trials, and particularly real world evidence trials, are moving in that direction, where we say people don't just have depression, they have lots of things, comorbid health and mental health issues, and even the line between what is a health issue and a mental health issue is starting to become very ambiguous. And I would say, you know, methods of capture that really do allow for that democratization. So, you know, I like like the use of cell phone technology as a way to digitally phenotype, because cell phones now are more ubiquitous in the world than clean drinking water. Just the difference in socioeconomic status as it relates to access to smartphones is just very rapidly falling away. And so you have a method by which, and also legislation in the US has allowed for that. So people can get access to a so-called Obama phone in the 21st century, where if they don't have a smartphone, they can get one. We've been involved in trials where people are able to actually get those technologies to help track them, or in hospital systems. So that's my opinion.
Thank you. So in our last minute or two, we really covered a broad spectrum of amazing, bold ideas in the future around sensing for diagnosis, for prognosis, and drug development. Any other things that we left off the table that anyone on the panel want to share?
So I think we really touched on the big areas, and I really want to commend my fellow panelists for coming up with some great ideas. One of the things I'll mention again is what I started with. Given the complexity of the CNS, can we really use AI to make sense from genes to phenotype and everything in between to reveal to us things we may never have even predicted. And I think that's where the power will come. Today, GWAS studies are revealing amazing things we wouldn't have thought of in Alzheimer's disease, but there's still, these association with these loss scores. Can we come up with polygenic risk scores? Can we come up with marrying those things with other things? And repeating something Isaac said, identify not just static things. We want to intervene as early as possible, but dynamic, actionable things. That's where I think this could really shine for neuroscience.
Thank you. Any other comment?
Well, I know we focused a lot on AI here, but I had my son explain to me what blockchain is several times. I still don't quite understand it, but I think the promise is that it's highly secure, but also you can store a lot of data, and it's basically available for everybody. So some of the things that both of you pointed out, I wonder whether that new technology may offer inroads into that. And then I don't know whether quantum computing and some of these things can help us with the enormous amount of data that we're going to have to collect and make sense of. So I'm sure there are people in the audience who've thought about applications of these other technologies as well to the future of medicine.
Yeah, I would say, going in two directions. First of all, echoing what Al's saying is that, there's just an enormous amount of infrastructure developing that allows you to do this level of computation. So now AWS offers me an enormous amount of services that allow me to do just very complicated models on the edge, rapidly give responses, and that's just something that requires an enormous amount of infrastructure and building that now we all have access to. And then going in the other direction, I think there's an enormous opportunity to go back to the well on treatments that have failed, but they've failed possibly because we haven't defined our phenotypes well, we haven't tracked how our patients are doing well, and we don't really know how those treatments work. And so I think that there's a big opportunity to say, could we reinvestigate some of these treatments that we've decided have failed because they don't relate to some outdated clinical measure?
I have one in particular, but I won't talk about that.
Poppy and then.
No. Definitely. Coming back to what phenotypes you're looking at, where we capture that information from, for me, is still one of the biggest gaps. Where I think that's one of the questions too that just came up, is how do you intersect and get people to actually give this data away? Whether I'm using breath as a phenotype, and is that in my car? Is it in my office? Is it's got to appear in places that are non-standard, non-traditional. My home clearly, but engaging people in a way that you can capture that information as seamlessly as possible, where a phenotype you might not have used before may become informative simply because of the ease of capture, that pairing that with other more standard traditional metrics is where the power lies. But then I think one thing that we haven't touched on, other people have, is data privacy within California, obviously GDPR, but you've got this is the one thing I want to say is, there is a definite climate of fear of tech, fear of technology, fear of capture of my biometrics, and how that's going to be used. That is very prevalent right now, just in the populace, and we've defined legislation in California that is potentially very limiting to the the companies that can most bring advantage, or to startups and to the companies that can be contributing to these spaces. And I think people need to have a much more active voice in writing that future before it gets too etched in stone right now, because it's being driven by a lot of groups that are not thinking about the potential. They're thinking more about they're not thinking about the positive potential, they're thinking about the potential fear. We obviously have to protect against that, but in a way that is not preventing the innovation we want to see happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, the entire panel, for a great discussion.
Thank you.